Welcome to another edition of Bobocast, a Harry Potter podcast. This week's Bobocast is brought to you by the Game Fun Podcast. I don't know if you know this if you're a listener, but the Bobocast, a Harry Potter podcast, is in a network of podcasts. So there's four, almost five other podcasts. Almost four other podcasts that are in this network. And those other podcasts, we support each other, we talk about similar stuff, and if you listen to one, you might be interested in others. And so I'm here to tell you about one, the Game Fun Podcast. The Game Fun Podcast has been kind enough to sponsor this podcast because the fellow who runs Game Fun Podcast is loaning me a piece of equipment that I need, and so, I'll give him a shout out, right? So anyways, check out the supervillain.me podcast network. You can find all of those podcasts on iTunes, especially the Game Fun Podcast. I'm not sure what they're talking about this week, but I imagine that it'll have something to do with video games. How's that for an ad? That's a pretty crappy advertisement, but really it's a small part, so it's not that big of a deal. Okay, well, check out the Game Fun Podcast and stay tuned for more Bobocast Podcast, a Harry Potter podcast. If you or your business is interested in sponsoring the Bobocast as well, we do accept Muggle currency and Muggle-owned and operated partners, such as the Gamecast. They're Muggles, you know. Hey, I got no harm against Muggles, whatever. Inquire further at bobocast@gmail.com. You can also at me on the Twitter, at Bobocast. Welcome, Potterheads and non-Potterheads who are trying to get a handle on what to expect from the upcoming film. This is the Bobocast, a Harry Potter podcast. My name is Andy. I'm your host, and I have no guests, as usual. It's just me, talking up a storm about Harry Potter. Got a bunch of questions today that I'm going to try and answer, and hopefully give, especially those of you who are not Harry Potter inclined, an idea of what's going on in our heads in this world and why we're so interested in it. This is kind of one of the reoccurring themes, is people who didn't get in it from the start have sort of had this kind of question about why it's so interesting to people, and there's a lot of answers I have, so I'll talk about some of those reasons, as well as be able to discuss our primary topic of the day, which is Severus Snape. Snape is one of the main characters in the entire book series and is very important in the final installment of the movies, or may not be. We don't really know. So I'll talk a lot more about Snape and how he works at the end of the podcast. But first, let's get to the trivia. Last week's trivia question was, who was the Minister of Magic before Cornelius Fudge? Cornelius Fudge was Minister of Magic through most of the Harry Potter series, and before Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic was Millicent Bulstrode, and that's all I know about her. I didn't really read up on anything more, but there you go. There's your trivia for the day. I'll try and come up with some pretty good trivia for this afternoon, but I'm blanking right now, so hopefully something comes into my head by the end of the podcast. Oh, we're doing something new with the podcast. What's been happening is I've been re-listening to them, is it's just this giant glut of information. And so what I'm going to do is about halfway through, I'm going to break it up. So I'm going to talk about this introduction and things like that and the questions, and then I'll have a little break, and it'll just be a little music break because I don't actually have any advertisers. Dang it. Bollocks? I don't know, whatever. I'll just keep bleeping things until I find a correct word that I can use. And then for the second half or so, we'll talk about the topic of the day, and then we'll wrap it up. So kind of give you a little cognitive break so you can interpret this in more than just one blah, blah, because I know that's how I talk, it's just blah. You should see my students' notes. It's ridiculous. But let's start with some of the questions. One of the questions was, a non-Harry Potter head asked, what's the deal with the lame last name? If you're going to have the chosen one, a wizard, an amazing sort of wizard, why would you just name them Potter, a very common last name? And if you kind of look through a lot of like traditional fantasy or sci-fi kind of adventures, especially comic books, they have these kind of cool last names that are Strength or the Chosen One or all this sort of things. And if you go through and look, like Albus Dumbledore has this fancy fun last name. Severus Snape has a cool last name. Draco Malfoy has a cool last name. And all these people have these pretty neat last names and first names. Yet Harry Potter is very plain. And so why Harry Potter? And I think actually that was a specific choice that J.K. Rowling made in terms of, well, you want to make a character that people identify with, especially kids. At the start of the story, Harry Potter's just some kid who doesn't know he's a wizard. He's just a beat-up little kind of a kid with glasses, and he doesn't know he's special, and he doesn't understand that. So kind of that specialness of him is supposed to override in spite of his entire background, including his last name. Potter's also, it's a very British name. It's just extremely English and normal. Same with Harry, so that's also probably part of it. Keep things very British, very commoner. He's just a normal kid with these special circumstances thrust upon him, is the reasoning behind the name, at least that I would judge. Now, we find out that that's completely not the case. He is far more special than anyone would ever imagine, but anyway, that might be one answer. Another question is, what's with the brooms? Why broomsticks? What's that got to do with anything? And, well, broomsticks and witches and wizards are clearly kind of linked in this magical mythology that we have in our mind. Part of what J.K. Rowling has done throughout the series is found magical wizarding world explanations for these myths that we have. So she explains broomsticks as being this sporting kind of event and a method of transportation. She explains dragons as being part of our mythology because they actually exist and they're maintained on reservations. She explains Yeti and werewolves and all these sorts of mythological creatures in terms of actually existing in the wizarding world. Brooms are just a part of that, to bring that element of fantasy and explain it with the Harry Potter wizarding world. There's actually some of the supplemental texts, as I will call them, some of the books that by J.K. Rowling that aren't in the actual series. One of them is called Quidditch Through the Ages, and Quidditch is the sport played on broomsticks, and explains the origin of broomsticks and how they evolved. And really the reasons that are provided there is that wizards and witches wanted magical means of transportation back in the Dark Ages or whatever it was, but they didn't want it spectacularly available to any muggle or non-magical person that just walked in. So what they do is they just enchanted broomsticks, and then they'd have them just in a corner, and if you walked in, you would just think it's a broom and nothing special. So it was kind of this camouflage designed to fit in with non-magical peoples. That's the explanation. Fine, cool, it makes sense, but broomsticks also make for a really interesting game of Quidditch, which helps move things along since they're fast and very agile and that sort of thing. Another question I had from one of our Nerd Fun hosts, Nate, was a personal question. It was, what stuff from the books do I feel should have been included in the movies? And as I've talked about before on this podcast, and I will again, is the movies are very tricky because they are designed for two audiences. They're designed, one, for an audience of people who have read the books. And so you always have this contingent of people who find fault with the movies because they left out their favorite part, or they changed around the order of some things, or who is who, or whatever it happens to be. And some of the movies, they totally erase a variety of characters. They just leave them completely out. Fantastic characters, really interesting to add layers to the stories that you would maybe want in. On the other hand, you have this other audience who has not read the books, who will not read the books, and you have to make these movies for them, and you have to make them make sense. I'm of the mind, I'm in between. I don't really care if the stuff from the books and the movies is one-to-one accurate. In fact, I think most of the time you need to remove more stuff from the movies and make it a more interesting film. My prime example that I always go back to is the fourth movie. There's 3 tasks. And in the 3 tasks, the first task is they gotta get past a dragon. Second task is they have to go under a lake and rescue their friends from mer people who don't attack them. They're just holding them. And so really they just have to hold their breath for an hour, basically. And the third task, they have to make it through a maze filled with magical peril. Now, in the books, those three things make sense because of the way it's ordered and the rising action and suspense. However, in the movies, getting past the dragon is the most exciting one of all of those. And it's such a cool scene that it needs to go closer to the end, more of a building, rising climax. They should have totally switched the order, I think, and had the mermaids go first, skipped a big chunk of the movie, changed stuff around, and took more artistic license. I believe that because it would have made a better movie. But of course, Potterheads might disagree with me. But I think the movies and the books are really different kinds of things. So I don't think anything should have been included in the movies that I can think of right now off the top of my head. And more stuff should have, in fact, been taken out. One of the cool things I found this week was a review of Order of the Phoenix, the 5th book. It was a handwritten review written by Stephen King. It was just his thoughts on the book and the writing and how things worked. And there was a lot of really cool, insightful sorts of things to see from a very accomplished author as a criticism and praise of J.K. Rowling's writing. And one of the things he really narrowed in on, though, that I've had in my mind as an interesting sort of concept with the books is he was marveling at how the series had somehow transitioned from kids' books to these all-ages books that are meant for everybody. And this is one of the neat things about the books as a series. You start with number 1 and number 2, and they're clearly kids' books. They're for young readers. They're for parents to read to their kids as bedtime stories. They're kind of scary, but really the villainy is not that bad. There's threat of death, but there's never... Well, I guess there is actually. But there's not really the dramatic death or panic of some of the later books. But then over time, especially in book 3 and 4, J.K. Rowling writes it so it changes and turns into this other kind of story, which is how you get people describing it as, oh no, these ones are dark, these ones are for adults. And I don't think that's a very useful way to describe them, although it's relatively true. What's more useful is to say she evolves as a writer because Harry and his friends are growing older. And as they age, like the storytelling and the complexity of their thought ages as well. And so you get more complex thought, more complex storylines. And so the stories move from this very basic kind of level. It's like Roald Dahl books, James and the Giant Peach, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory for the first Harry Potter. It's goofy, it's whimsical, it has that kind of fun in there. And so if you just read that first book, you might sit there and wonder, like, what the hell are people so interested in this? This is just a kid's book. But as they evolve, as you grow with the characters, the story complexity gets more intense, the rising action and the suspense gets more intense as well. So it turns into this different kind of story. And that's a really marvelous part about that series. And some of my friends have asked, how come Potterheads get so involved? When they turn on the movies, they just see kids running around with little sticks and wearing silly robes. And that's, while that may be the case, that's what they see. If you go through it from the start to the finish, then you grow with the kids. You've experienced this change in writing, this change in the storytelling, this change in the importance of everything. So it turns into a very different kind of experience going through. To that regard, the stuff from the books that I feel should have been included in the movies, it's really hard to say. I would honestly love to see 2 sets of movies. One set of movies that is basically what they have now. They take out more stuff that has to do with the goofy magical stuff, and they take out more stuff that has to do with intent and thoughtful plot and all this, and they keep in goofy magical stuff and relationship advice and basic fundamental action and that sort of thing. And another set that focuses more on inner monologue and the thought processes and understanding why things happen. I think that could be a really cool series to see and be interesting. And who knows, someday we might have it. They're going to remake these movies at some point. It's just part of our world. They always will remake movies. That might be bad news or sad news to some of you listening. Some of you have grown up with these movies, and these are like canon. But no, they're going to remake them. Just have that in your mind. Don't be surprised when that happens. Hello, and welcome back. You did not go anywhere, but of course I did. When I last left you, it was 7 hours ago. My kid was sick at daycare, so I went to pick her up, and then I spent the rest of the evening with her, and then I spent the evening with my wife, and ate dinner, and worked in the garden, and did another podcast, and all that stuff. So, anyways, I'm back. Welcome back to the Bobocast podcast. I have no idea what I was talking about, is what happened. So, we got this little interlude. I think I was talking about something about the books, so whatever. The main point of today's podcast in the Bobocast was to talk about Snape. And the character's name is Severus Snape. He is, in all of the books, he is one of the teachers at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and he is a generally very disliked character. So Snape, very different from actually Voldemort, you know who, because he is basically the usual suspect, the most likely suspect that Harry and Harry's best friend Ron always have like in the back of their mind as someone who might be up to no good. So he serves this role of a hated teacher. He's very disliked. He doesn't get along well with Harry and the people that Harry likes. And so he plays this really integral role throughout all of the books and through a lot of the movies in making some specific kinds of things happen. Now, if you really want the story to make sense in the upcoming Harry Potter movie, you need to know who Snape is and what he's all about. Now, to enjoy the movie, you probably don't really need to know who he is or what he's all about. But honestly, that really depends on what the movie ends up being about. From the previews, the upcoming movie this summer looks like it's a ton of action. We know there's a couple of big action scenes coming up from the books. The movie can only be a couple hours long, and the action scenes that need to happen are going to be very substantial. A giant battle at Hogwarts, a wizard battle with giants and giant spiders and magic and all this sort of crazy stuff. And then there's a dragon scene as well that'll be really intense and pretty big. So most likely, I'm willing to bet, given the amount of story they've gotten into in the first Harry Potter 7 that came out last year, I'm going to bet that they scale back on a lot of the story elements and do mostly action. But we don't really know. If you already know the story, then you're going to have a good time anyway, just seeing that action unfold and seeing how the characters interact and that sort of thing. If you don't know the story, then honestly, you probably don't need to know that much about Snape. But let's say you're a nerd and you're curious, which is why you're listening to this podcast. So you want to hear more about who Snape is and what he's all about. So I'm going to do what I usually do. I'm going to go through the books very briefly and describe Snape's role and kind of explain like who he is as a character and why we come to really like him and despise him throughout the series. So book number 1, Snape is the usual suspect. Harry suspects him as the villain, and so does Ron, Harry's best friend, of being the actual villain. Of his own, like they think Snape's up to everything. He hates Harry, he hates Ron, he makes life hard for them in class because he's their teacher. He's interested in the dark arts, he's antisocial, he wears black, like he's just got all these usual suspect sort of things about him. Turns out he's not the bad guy, and he's been helping Harry stay alive and defeat the villain in that book. In the next 2 books, he is a mean teacher. He's just generally bad-natured and makes things harder for them. And in the 3rd book, he's also a suspected kind of villain. Like, again, Harry and Ron start developing this suspicion of him, thinking he's not really a good guy, that he's hurting one of their friends, this sort of thing. And this all goes back to Snape's history in Hogwarts with people around Harry, such as Harry's father and mother and Harry's father's group of friends. They all hated Snape, like back schoolboy rivalries. And we find all this out throughout the series, mostly in number 4 and number 5, which are next, where Snape is again kind of a suspected villain, and we just learn more of his backstory. And one of the major elements of his backstory is that he is used to be a Death Eater. And the Death Eaters, again, are like the generals, the main bad guys that support Voldemort, our main villain. So we know that he was a Death Eater, and that at some point he turned and joined the good guy side. So in book 5, we see that backstory unfold more, and since Voldemort has come back, then Snape starts playing this double agent role. So he goes back to Voldemort and says he's working for him, but Voldemort sends him back to work at the school for the good guys, and so really we don't know. He definitely is playing this double agent role where he's giving away some secrets, he's trading in secrets, he's suspected by both sides, and he's this very shady character. All throughout this, of course, he is still a mean teacher. He's not nice to Harry. He hates Harry and Harry's godfather and Harry's dad and everything like that. But continuously, Snape is like evidence comes to light that demonstrates that he is innocent, that he is not really a villain. He's just a mean guy. This happens over and over and over again. And always throughout, Snape is kind of redeemed. By the end of every book, he's done something to remind us. He's one of the good guys. He's one of the good guys. He's one of the good guys. Until book 6, where we have a cliffhanger at the end and a very shocking thing happens that everyone's heard about. And if you haven't, then here's a major spoiler alert. Spoiler, I'm going to tell you what happens in book 6 that came out years ago. Throughout the whole movie, again, Harry is suspecting him of being a villain. And his friends at this time are now like, come on, Harry, you got to get over it. He's not a villain. It's been 6 fucking books. He's one of the good guys. And at the end of the book, he kills Albus Dumbledore. So you may have heard the spoiler, Snape kills Dumbledore, as like one of these major, major twist of fate, I am your father moments. And it totally is. It's just this unbelievable occurrence that happens even in the books. It's the setup that out of nowhere, these words are uttered, the killing spell, Avada Kedavra, and you have to reread it again and again because, remember, throughout all of these books, he's been suspected and redeemed, suspected and redeemed, suspected and redeemed, and finally, at the end, he kills one of our primary, major, major characters who we would never have suspected this. So that's really Snape's background and why he has become such a hated character. In the 7th book, Final Story, he's playing on the bad guys team. He's not more special than Voldemort. He's just another one of the bad guys. They don't like him. They keep him in mind, but really he's not a major player. And so in movie 7, part 1, I think he barely makes an appearance, if at all. So we really don't know how he's going to fit into the story. The audience, in terms of the movies, hasn't been reminded, at least if they've seen 7, about how important he is. And we'll see in the second movie if they decide to bring his role into greater prominence. In reality, in the actual story, Snape has a much greater prominence, and this is a major spoiler alert here. I'm not going to do the huge spoiler, but if you want to be surprised and they do the story, then heads up. Stop listening and share with your friends and still follow us on Twitter and all that. But at the end of book 7, Snape once again redeems himself, and in a way that is beyond all of the other redemptions, that really shows him in this light and explains even why he killed Dumbledore and all that sort of thing. Now, I'm really not that confident that he's going to be able to, that the movie director, I think it's David Yates, is going to be able to pull that off in a way that is convincing, because it took a lot of depth. It really took a ton of flashbacks and memories across the span of all of these 7 books to make that make sense. And I've read book 7 a lot. I mean, I don't think I'm up to 10 times yet, but I've read it a lot of times already. And it does take some sorting through to figure out, well, why did he do these things? How did that all work? How did the pieces fall together? So I'm going to bet that's pretty complex for a movie, and they're going to kind of, zip over it and do some kind of redemptive tropes there. We'll see. But regardless, Snape is one of these main characters who you can't go through the series without understanding who Snape is. You got to know Harry and Voldemort. You got to know Ron and Hermione. You got to know who Snape is. And he is this quintessential main character, always a usual suspect of a villain. Suspected redeemed, suspected redeemed, suspected redeemed, and finally Snape kills Dumbledore. Like the major occurrence happens in Book 6, which is one of the greatest twists in literature. I'll go ahead and say it, in literature, alongside with the great movie twist of I Am Your Father in Star Wars Empire Strikes Back. Just one of these great characters. He's written really well, and Alan Rickman plays him in the movies. He's acted very well as well. Some of the funniest lines are done by Snape as well throughout the movies, at least most enjoyable. So anyways, there's a whole bunch of information about Severus Snape. About Severus Snape, who is the potions master for 5 of the books, is the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher in the 6th book, and of course is the Hogwarts headmaster in the 7th book until he is until the end when some things happen. But anyways, that's going to be this week's Bobocast. Gave you a lot of backstory on Snape, explained a lot about the writing and how J.K. did all that sort of thing. I had a really good time recording this time, other than the crazy 7-hour break in the middle for me. But something I do want to talk to you guys about before I sign off is the supervillain.me podcast network. If you head to the website supervillain.me, you'll see nothing, but by the end of the week, you will see something there. Essentially, the Bobocast, a Harry Potter podcast, is a part of a greater podcast network, which includes some other podcasts, including a Nerd Fun podcast, the Game Fun podcast, the H Hour, and Phobocast. All of these have different sorts of themes. Some are safe for work, some are not safe for work, some are just totally filthy and disgusting. This is the only Harry Potter-based one, of course. But the others have all sorts of different topics. I highly encourage you, if you enjoy this, go check out those other podcasts. And if you don't like it, but you know somebody who will, share that. We're trying to have a conversation with interested people. So if you like Harry Potter, listen to this. Have that conversation with us. Talk to me at Bobocast on Twitter, or email me at bobocast@gmail.com. Send an owl. Have that conversation, because that's what this is about. It's very personal. It's not about like trying to advertise and make a ton of money. If we do, that'd be great, but it's not the main focus. The main focus is to get listeners and people participating, and you can do that by checking out these other podcasts, talking to my other friends who run those other podcasts, and checking out supervillain.me this weekend when it's up and running. So we're having a big opening kind of bid in this next coming week, and it should be pretty cool. It'll be a fun experiment, at least. That's why this whole thing started. Anyways, I really appreciate you guys checking this out, and share about this podcast on Twitter. Share this with people who might like it. If I said something stupid, then email me at bobocast@gmail.com or talk to me at Bobocast on Twitter. I'm always on the Twitter. And you can, excuse me, you can correct me or explain whatever it is you happen to want to talk about. This week's trivia question is about a magical creature. And there's a book called Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, which is one of the supplemental texts. And one of the animals in here, I have a question about it in relation to one of the books. So the name of this animal is a gnarl. The gnarl, Northern Europe and America, is usually mistaken for a hedgehog by muggles. That's not magical people. The two species are indeed indistinguishable except for one important behavioral difference. So your trivia question is, what is that behavioral difference? Part 1. And part 2 is, what did they do in the books to detect that difference? So basically, what is a gnarl and how do you detect it from another hedgehog? So there's your trivia for this week. I hope you guys had a good time on Bobocast. Read something and tell me about it at bobocast@gmail.com or at bobocastme on Twitter. If you have thoughts, wishes, secret desires, or need some wizardly advice, feel free to send it in an owl or an email and just ask. Until next time, in the words of Dumbledore, nitwit, blubber, udment, tweak!